Standing still for a long while, the two men had dismounted from their horses. They took in the scenery, amazed and entranced by the stunning, untamed landscape. There was a quiet bond forming between them and the land. With each passing moment, the unspoken compact between Harold and Hardanger grew stronger, and when they finally mounted their horses, it was in a state of reverential silence that spoke of their deep connection to the wilds of Iceland. When Harold and Hardanger arrived from their expedition, their wives had significant news to share. They had been perched atop a rolling hill, peering out at the fjord and its surroundings, when they noticed smoke emanating from an island. They were confident in their sighting and wished to warn the brothers to be more careful and not to venture out alone any more. However, their words fell on deaf ears. The brothers were too intrigued by the smoke on the horizon to pay heed to the wives' warnings. Instead, they rallied their men and prepared to investigate the source of the smoke. Halvig and Astrid pleaded with them to reconsider, but the brothers wanted to know more. They believed that even if there were people on the island, it would most likely be a peaceful party that have been stranded. So they ventured off in the direction of the smoke, setting sail in their boat with weapons in tow. At first, there was no sign of life on the deserted island. They circled it, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, but there was no one there. They decided it was time to dock, and chose a creek nestled on the south side of the island. Once they landed, they stumbled upon a pitiful boat, so shoddy that they wouldn't trust it to cross a fjord, hiding amongst the rocks. They trekked further up the island and discovered a hut, cleverly hidden in a hollow. As they approached, a man donning a splendid cloak and headdress emerged from the hut with a staff in hand. He was accompanied by some lean figures, blackened with grime and poorly dressed. Exiting the hut, they remained rooted before the door, refusing to budge. Recognizing the type of people they were, Hardanger, Harold, and several members of their crew spoke some Irish, and so edged closer, inquiring about these odd folk that resided on a barren island. These Irish monks, one of whom was clutching a cup of water, clearly weren't thrilled about Hardanger and Harold's entourage encroaching on their space. The Smagnus brothers stood at a distance, questioning them. The monks were tight-lipped with their responses, but Harold eventually coaxed information out of them, wading through terse, brief sentences. They stated that they had lived there for years, hearing tales of this far-off land, many other monks before them seeking it out. Although they hadn't come across any fellow worshippers, they stayed put on this island, which happened to be their initial landing point. When the brothers were about to head back towards their boat, the man sporting the headdress, cloak, and staff halted them in their tracks with one query. "Why have you come here?" Harold informed them that they had journeyed here to explore the land and planned to colonize it. His response caused a bit of a stir and disunity amongst the monks. Their leader plainly expressed to Harold that this land was hallowed and exclusively reserved by God for Christians. No heathen had ever resided there before and never would. Should they migrate here, then every sort of calamity would befall them, until they acquiesced to being baptized and transferred allegiance to the Christian faith. Harold responded quietly, justifying his faithfulness to his gods and insisting that it would be wrong for him to be anything less than devoted. The monk retorted that heathens put their trust in idols, not gods. Undeterred, Harold emphasized that the Aces had always protected him and his family. He bid them farewell and left with Hardanger and his men. As they departed, the monk sprinkled water in their wake, even on the waves that had lapped at their boat. Harold and Hardanger found this amusing, the former smiling and the latter laughing outright. When they returned, they smoothed things over with Halvig and Astrid by explaining that the inhabitants of the island were peaceful and unarmed, with no weapons other than a cup of water. They dubbed it Monk's Island. As the autumn chill set in, the Magnus brothers settled into their turf house. Harold had a smaller structure built outside, where he placed crudely carved wooden images of Sigfather and Asgard. When the time for the autumn sacrificial feast arrived, he offered an ox and hosted a small celebration. Hardanger distanced himself from such activities. During the feast, he went out to catch birds by day and slept soundly at night. The rustling of the autumn leaves spoke to him during his solitary wanderings in the mountains, and he didn't pay much attention to catching birds. He enjoyed the peace and quiet, only targeting lone birds and releasing groups of grouse. Harold's loyalty to the gods through his sacrificial feast and devotion to the wooden idols tested Hardanger's brotherly love, as he struggled to understand and abide by Harold's beliefs. Time and time again, Hardanger found himself struggling to control his mounting irritation. He knew it wasn't fair to take his disdain for Harold's gods out on his brother, since Harold had always been accepting of Hardanger's own beliefs and thoughts. But the resentment burned within him, and sometimes it spilled out, directed at Harold. Oddly, though, Hardanger didn't feel the same way toward Astrid. He didn't begrudge her loyalty to her own faith and her father's beliefs, even though they were so different from his own. He respected her too much to wish that she would abandon her gods to follow his own lack of faith. That day would have been a heartbreak for him, and no mistake. Winter came to them with a fierce chill that frosted the landscape without bringing too much snow. Harold and Hardanger had plans to showcase a bit of the south country around the Svanna fjords with skiing expeditions for Halveig and Astrid, but the weather wasn't cooperative. Nevertheless, they took comfort in the fact that their sheep and goats were able to forage for themselves all season, save a few tempestuous days. They noted how scarce the population stayed, and how the few who lived there could each own large flocks. The sheep and goats, too, were hardy creatures, spending their time up in the mountains and feeding off hardy grass nestled between the rocks. Their wool stayed snowy white, and their frames grew strong and sturdy. The goats, in particular, had found several cavernous hollows in the nearby mountain to spend their nights and stay sheltered during storms. They looked quite content there, even snug. Despite the short daylight hours and long evenings with little company, the winter months never seemed to drag on. They didn't feel isolated or alone. Rather, they came closer together as a group, bonding in ways that the summertime could never have allowed. They gathered around the warm fire, each occupied with their own task. Harold and Hardanger whittled away at the wood, while Halveig and Astrid spun and dyed yarn, creating cozy mittens, handkerchiefs, and beautifully woven bands. The chatter was light, filled with laughter and whispered conversations. But the joyous atmosphere was soon interrupted by the arrival of a new life. In the midst of winter, Halveig gave birth to a son. Harold christened the baby Asgardston, in honor of his dear friend from Hafnarfjordur, who had been tragically taken by fate. As Halveig savored the joys of motherhood, Astrid struggled to hide her sadness. She longed to experience the joy of bearing a child herself, but it seemed that fate had other plans. As the winter thawed into spring, the family prepared to leave behind their new home in search of greener pastures. The W. Magnus brothers busied themselves with preparations for their eventual migration, unwilling to leave the land they had come to love in just one short year. Even Hardanger, who often longed for travel and adventure, was reluctant to leave the sturdy hearth they had made for themselves. But the practicalities of dwindling supplies and uncertain weather forced them to bid farewell to the land that had become their friend. As they sailed away, the land basked in the warmth of the sun, with the cheerful songs of returning birds filling the air. They left with heavy hearts, uncertain of what the future would hold. But for that precious year, they had found a home and a family, bringing joy and laughter to each other during those long winter nights. Hardanger knew that Astrid had agreed to his impulsive plan, but he also understood that deep down she wanted to travel with the rest of their companions. Astrid's love for him was boundless, and she was willing to sacrifice even the sweet fragrance of pine trees from her homeland for his sake. However, despite her brave acceptance of staying behind, her composure faltered slightly, and her lips trembled. Throughout the winter, she had eagerly anticipated the moment when they would sail through the islands to Drammen, a desire she had kept hidden in her steadfast heart like a precious secret. Even when Hardanger departed with the others, that longing still lingered within her. But as he sailed away from the shore, it stirred up old feelings of unrest in his soul. Chapter 4. The brothers sailed across the sea to Norway with a favourable wind, reaching Harold's house in Drammen only 10 days after passing the skerries outside the Svanafjords. When they disembarked, only Astrid felt a sense of homecoming. Harold and Hardanger had already mentally detached from their birthplace, and Halveig, whose true home was wherever Harold was, had never grown familiar with the area. Hardanger immediately expressed his desire to embark on a Viking expedition come summer. He cited his need for serfs and the simplicity of acquiring goods for their upcoming journey to Iceland the following spring. But his true reason was an unexplainable restlessness in his blood, akin to a bow drawn taut for too long. Astrid, per her usual laissez-faire approach, raised no objections and even offered her fervent support. Little did she know that the coming summer would be her last spent at home. Harold knew his brother all too well and saw no issue with the plan. They needed goods, which they could acquire at a lower cost through their own efforts, and he didn't pry into his brother's motivations beyond that. Thus, it was agreed early on that Hardanger would indeed go on his Viking expedition. Upon landing in Drammen, Hardanger quickly got to work preparing for his journey. He had procrastinated somewhat, so he had to rush his preparations as much as possible. With no time to spare for rest or meals, Hardanger hastily gathered all the goods he and Harold had in stock, and loaded his dragon ship, along with the other ship he had in reserve. 2 ships would have to do. There weren't enough goods for more. Just days after returning home to Drammen, Hardanger sailed out again, leaving Astrid to the pine tree scent on the islands. He had no idea that the separation, which barely registered with him, filled Astrid with burning anxiety and unrest that wouldn't dissipate until they were together again. Out on the sea, Hardanger let the salty breeze and the anticipation of adventure distract his mind. He travelled to Ireland, trading and ravaging wherever he docked, and unlike last time, Harold hadn't cautioned him to be careful. Hardanger took full advantage of his newfound freedom and indulged in a daring, reckless conduct that delighted his men and pleased the gods. Throughout the summer, Hardanger plundered and pillaged, accumulating valuable cloths, metals, and other goods. He even managed to capture 10 serfs, wiry men with tough dispositions and evil eyes, who proved themselves to be excellent rowers and hard workers. Luck, always a fickle mistress, smiled upon Hardanger, at least until a harrowing experience on a seemingly deserted coast with treacherous skerries and rocky islands threatened to undo everything. He ordered his ships, heavy with the summer's valuable plunder, to be rowed between the jagged rocks to conceal them in a secluded cove he discovered during a solitary adventure, while his men went on a raid in the nearby town. Hardanger needed as many of his men as he could muster, since the target was a sizable, well-to-do city. Leaving a small contingent to keep watch over the captive slaves, whom he dared not set free while still so close to their homeland, he and the remainder of his men disembarked and headed towards the forest, buzzing with excitement and anticipation. This would be the last great exploit of the summer, and Hardanger hoped to acquire a bounty significant enough to require hijacking a ship to transport it. Only time would tell. The woodland they planned to traverse was situated on a sharp mountainside, descending towards the shore and riddled with deep, rocky gullies populated with shrubs. Hardly had Hardanger and his entourage ventured far into the dense and impassable forest, when they were confronted by an enemy that outnumbered them significantly. The townspeople seemed to have spies patrolling the coastline, and they were fully prepared for their arrival. Before Hardanger could rally his troops, they were set upon by the enemy with raucous battle cries and clanging weaponry. Amidst the commotion, Hardanger couldn't spare a moment to gauge his men's status. The townsfolk instantly recognized him as their adversary's commander and swarmed around him with raised swords and brandished axes. Hardanger had to relinquish his spear to one attacker, while he cleaved open the head of the other with his axe. But he had barely taken a breath before a horde of howling Irishmen descended upon him. Although they did not encircle him, Hardanger was too occupied squaring off against his assailants with his axe on one side and his sword on the other. He'd tossed his shield aside and had no time to contemplate the reason that his enemies were holding their distance. As the skirmish intensified, he was forced backwards into a thicket of trees. Hardanger, at that moment, believed that 6 was the smallest number he could reasonably take with him to the afterlife. However, he was still lacking 2, and as fate would have it, he lost his footing. The fall was abrupt, and his sword slipped from his hand. But he managed to cling to a tree root with his axe, as he fell over the edge of a ravine, hanging precariously in the air. His assailants celebrated, shouting in triumph. They taunted and ridiculed Hardanger as he swung back and forth, suspended over the bottomless ravine. They poked and prodded him with their spears, relishing in the idea of a slow and painful death. All seemed lost for Hardanger. As he looked down at the bottom of the ravine, he saw only bushes and heather. With no viable alternative, he let go of the root, hoping against hope that he would survive the fall. He had no time to contemplate his fate. As he tumbled through the air, he saw men closing in on either side of him, hoping to surround him and ensure he met his end. The fall was long and disorienting. Hardanger turned 2 somersaults before landing with a thud against something hard. His ears were ringing, and he briefly lost consciousness. When he finally came to, he found himself lying in the heather, gazing up at the delicate green leaves of stunted trees. His instincts kicked in, and he reached out for his weapons, only to find them gone. It was then that he realized the full extent of his peril. Without hesitation, he jumped to his feet after his fall, quickly ensuring that he had no broken bones. He grabbed his helmet and crouched down, determined to make a run for it. Despite his stiff limbs, he rushed into the densest part of the woods and headed toward the coast. As he ran, Hardanger heard men approaching, chattering loudly further down the ravine. He stopped in his tracks and stood still, his body rigid. His eyes darted around, searching for a hiding spot, but he couldn't see anything suitable. A small depression in the ground at his feet offered a sliver of hope, though it wouldn't conceal him entirely. With each passing moment, he heard his heart racing faster and faster, feeling his chest constrict with fear, imagining the agony of being drawn and quartered. But just when he was about to surrender and flee back up the ravine, where he knew he would run into more enemies, he spied a large, flat rock. Eureka! Salvation was within reach. Excitement trembled through Hardanger's body as he lifted the stone and rolled it toward the depression. He lay down, wrapped his cloak around himself, and tried to shrink into as small a space as possible before shoving the rock onto himself. There he stayed, his heart racing as his pursuers approached. Listening to their conversation, he realized they believed he lay exactly where he had fallen and feared he might have died from his injuries. The prospect of any more fun was finished, yet they urged one another to continue looking for him and threatened to flay alive the red-haired devil if they found him. Hardanger lay underneath the flat stone, biting down on a corner of his cloak to stifle the laughter that bubbled inside him. He shook with uncontrollable convulsions, which only made him worry that he might dislodge the stone and expose himself to his would-be captors. However, they moved on, confident that he hadn't survived his fall. At that moment, Hardanger felt quite merry, realizing that even the thinnest sliver of hope is enough to fuel the bravest heart. As the men faded away, their voices echoed into the deep ravine, gradually fading into the distance. Hardanger waited, making sure there was nobody left behind, then cautiously lifted the stone and began to move. Scrambling along slowly and crouching low, he headed towards the harbor. He kept a watchful eye out for any lurking enemies, but luck was on his side and he successfully reached the shore without incident. Pausing for a moment to catch his breath, Hardanger looked around, taking in the cool air of the sea. He knew the enemy would be watchful and alert even in daylight, making it nearly impossible for him to make it back to his ship, assuming he even still had one at all. It was impossible for him to know how it had gone with his men, or if the enemy had already seized control of the ships. It was a mess he had gotten himself into, and he couldn't help but worry about when he would see Astrid again. Hardanger's gaze fell upon the fjord, spotting an island with stunted fir trees growing a short distance away. The island was surrounded by smaller ones and looked almost inviting to him. The enemy would never think to look for him beyond the borders of the land, or so he thought. Without much hesitation, Hardanger hid his cloak, helmet, and any other items that could restrict him under a pile of stones. He swiftly jumped into the water and swam on his back, keeping a sharp eye on the shoreline in case he was being followed. But he saw no signs of life on the coast. Finally, he arrived at the island, soaked and tired, and crawled his way up the smooth, rocky side. As he lay under the safety of a large stone, enjoying the warm sun, Hardanger couldn't help but drift off into a deep sleep. But uneasy dreams plagued him, and he awoke to the intense heat of the setting sun piercing his eyes. He realized then that he had slept the entire day, and to his surprise, a grey cloak made of coarse material lay draped over his body. Surprised and disoriented, Hardanger looked around him and finally spotted a man sitting nearby, staring with gentle and curious eyes. Hardanger didn't trust the stranger's gentle gaze. His hand instinctively reached for a weapon, finding none. He remembered with relief that the stranger appeared to be unarmed, too. Thin and emaciated, the man's appearance was as ragged as his tangled hair and beard. But his eyes and smile shone with life, vibrant and intense, an odd contrast to the atmosphere of death hanging around him. The stranger got up and disappeared behind a rock. Hardanger strained his ears but heard no sound. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was still dreaming. The stranger soon reappeared, this time with some shellfish he deftly opened with a sharp-edged stone. Hardanger grabbed a couple of the shellfish and devoured them hungrily. Despite his gratitude, he felt a wave of disgust and forced himself to declare that he was full. The stranger's indulgent smile never left his face as he finished off the rest of the shellfish. He then asked Hardanger how he was and how he ended up stranded on the island. Hardanger concocted a story about falling off a ship and being adrift for days before washing up on shore. He made sure to demonstrate his strength, hoping to dissuade any potential threats. The stranger's smile never faltered, and he quietly beckoned Hardanger to follow him. He led his guest to the other side of the island, where the mouth of a modest cave awaited. "I live here," he said in a gentle voice. "You are the first guest to come, and the only man I have seen in many years. Surely God had a special purpose in sending you to me, brother, however that may have happened. If you are willing to share my cave for the night, you are more than welcome. You can swim to the shore if you are brave enough, and if not, you can stay here with me." "What brings you to this island?" Hardanger asked the man, surprised to find no signs of mistrust or a roving eye in his behavior. "I serve my God," the man replied, making the sign of the cross. It slowly dawned on Hardanger that he was in the company of one of the mad Irish monks. From that moment, he no longer feared the man. The monks were peaceful, albeit mad, people. Yet there was something mysterious and unsettling about him that made Hardanger feel uneasy. "How do you live?" he inquired after a long pause. The man smiled his gentle smile and pointed to a pot-shaped hollow in the rock, filled to the brim with seawater. "At high tide, God sometimes sends me food, or I dive for shellfish when I am hungry. There is also an abundance of seaweed here. I do not need much. Shouldn't God who feeds the birds also feed me?" "How do you serve your God?" Hardanger grew curious. "I pray, fast, and lead a pure life," the monk replied quietly. "Who is your God?" Hardanger pressed further. "The one true God, the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost," the monk answered in his gentle voice, once again making the sign of the cross. "What is his name?" Hardanger sat down on a stone step outside the cave and fixed his wondering eyes on the monk. "He is called Jehovah. His Son, whose sacred name is Jesus Christ, let himself be born as a man and shed his blood for men to wash away their sins." Hardanger sat in silence on the rocky shore, the sound of the waves lapping at his feet. His mind was plagued with memories of the God they called Jesus Christ. He couldn't understand why this seemingly powerless deity could control men's hearts. Carved and painted images of Jesus hung in his mind, bleeding from wounds inflicted during his crucifixion. The monk appeared before him, casting a golden glow around his head in the waning light of the sun. Hardanger felt a strange unease settle over him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake off. He didn't want to hear about Jesus, this God that he despised. The monk let out a sorrowful sigh. "As you wish, my brother. Perhaps one day you will see the grace of the Lord," he said in a soft, feminine voice. Hardanger asked him to speak about foreign lands, knowing that the monk had lived a simple life on the island. But the monk replied that he hadn't journeyed to any other land except for Ireland, and that he was content with his simple life on the island. The monk suggested reading about a place called Paradise instead, and disappeared into a low cave. Hardanger sat and waited, listening to the sound of the waves, wondering about this strange, silent man who seemed to be at peace with his life, despite its apparent limitations. After a brief absence, he returned with a mysterious scroll in his grasp. As he unfurled it, Hardanger's eyes widened in amazement at what he saw. Pieces of skin covered in strange, arcane markings. The monk sat down and began to recite in a steady, devout tone. "There exists a place known as Paradise. It is not in the heavens, nor on earth, but rather suspended between the two and divinely placed by God himself. Paradise lies 40 miles above the highest point the flood ever reached, and is of equal breadth and length on all sides. No hill nor valley mars its smooth surface, and it is forever free of frost and snow. The land within is lush and fruitful, yet free of dangerous beasts and any sort of imperfection. A pristine well named the Well of Life provides water, while a grand and beautiful forest called Radion Saltus boasts trees with evergreen leaves that never wither. These trees tower straight and tall, so high that their tops vanish from sight. Each bears an array of blossoms, fruits, and apples of all colours, and not a single leaf ever falls from their boughs. In the heart of Paradise the trees stand tall and proud, and one forbidden fruit tree carries the knowledge of good and evil in its fruit, which was once eaten by Adam himself. Above, there is neither darkness nor night. Perpetual day reigns, illuminated 7 times more brightly by the light of all the stars than the sun of our earthly realm. Angels stroll the hallowed land, content in keeping order and bestowed with joy and pleasure. Ever since God opened Paradise to the souls of good men, the pure-hearted have dwelt there, and so they shall until the end of days. The entrance was first opened at the moment when the thief's soul was carried there to rest beside the divine. In the beautiful land of Paradise there lives a majestic bird referred to as the phoenix. It is immense, with a form beyond description, and it claims the title of king among avians. The phoenix bathes happily in the well of life before soaring up to perch on the tallest tree existing in the land of paradise, basking in the warm rays of the sun. The phoenix, a spectacular and majestic bird, gleams with a light that rivals that of the sun's rays. Its entire body shines like gold, and its feathers are as if crafted by God's angels themselves. The bird's breast is stunning, and its beak is equally as beautiful as its feathers. Its eyes resemble clear crystal, and its feet are like a deep crimson red. When the phoenix migrates from paradise to Egypt for 5 weeks, a symphony of various birds flock to it, serenading the phoenix with countless melodies. Folk from the land flock towards it, mesmerized by its mystique, and greet it with a warm welcome. "Welcome, phoenix, to our land. You shine like red gold. You are the king of all the birds," they chant. During the 5 weeks that the phoenix is in Egypt, the residents create a wax and copper replica which closely resembles the real phoenix. As soon as it's built, all the birds bow down to honor it with joyful voices, and a beautiful red stripe glows along its back. Once the bird's time in Egypt is up, it heads back to paradise, surrounded by all manner of birds, some flying above it, others below, and some even on its sides. The phoenix's lifespan consists of precisely 1,000 winters, after which it burns itself to ashes and continues its cycle of rebirth. No one can tell if it is a male or female, apart from the Almighty himself. This tale occurred 4,000 years before the birth of Christ, as the story goes. The monk grew silent, surveying Hardanger, who bobbed opposite, fully engaged in the tale. The monk smiled, content with his listener's rapt attention, and went on with the story. The monk stopped in his tracks and gazed out into the fading light of the sunset. The twilight had crept in, dimming everything around him. He folded up his precious scroll with care, tying a band around it to keep it safe. Hardanger had been listening intently to the monk's recitation. At first he had been captivated by the man's hypnotic voice, but soon the endless chanting had begun to weigh heavily on Hardanger's eyes, and he struggled to stay awake. After a brief moment of silence from the monk, Hardanger couldn't resist the drowsiness any longer. His head descended onto his hands, and he drifted off to sleep. The monk let him slumber peacefully while he whispered secret prayers to the heavens. He begged the Almighty to grant him guidance in the mission of saving this heathen soul from the fires of eternal damnation. When the monk finally stirred Hardanger awake, he beckoned him to follow him into the cave. The chilly night air was creeping in, and they would be warmer together. The monk welcomed Hardanger to his bed of straw and offered him his cloak. As Hardanger awoke, he saw that night had already fallen. The moon cast its pale glow upon the darkness, creating an eerie atmosphere. Hardanger knew that the time had come for him to leave the island, but his curiosity got the better of him. He wanted to explore the monk's cave before he departed. The monk lit a small fire, and they crept into the depths of the low cave together. Hardanger's eyes focused on a magnificent sword standing against the cave wall. The weapon was adorned with a golden hilt and a glittering blade inlaid with gold. Hardanger was awestruck by its beauty. He tried to hide his fascination from the monk and asked how he had come to possess such a treasured item. The man replied quietly and with deep reverence, explaining that the sword had been inherited from his father and that he had brought it to the cave to keep it out of harm's way. Although he had considered throwing it away, he couldn't bear to part with such a remarkable item. And so it lay in the deepest recesses of the cave, an object of beauty and mystery. With gentle care, he cradled the sword in his hand and presented it to Hardanger. Hardanger, filled with greed, refrained from touching it, fearful of revealing his covetousness. The monk stood solemnly before them, fixated on the sword. "They who slaughter with the blade shall perish by it," he murmured, his voice seemingly carrying a spell belonging to the weapon. Hardanger scoffed in disbelief and feigned weariness before sprawling on a bed of hay, his thoughts consumed by the prospect of finding his men and his ships. The monk retrieved the sword and extinguished the light, laying beside Hardanger and draping his cloak over them both. Hardanger lay awake, his mind racing with doubts and fears as he pondered his success in finding his men and the return of his ships. As soon as the monk's snores filled the cavern, Hardanger slowly rose from his makeshift bed and seized the sword. His conscience pricked him as he tiptoed out of the cave and into the darkness, leaving the monk to sleep unknowingly. Emerging into the brisk night air, Hardanger breathed a sigh of relief and paused for just a moment before setting off across the island and diving into the water, sword held tightly between his teeth. Upon reaching the shore, he retrieved his cloak and belongings, half fearing that they had been stolen. Finding them still there, he donned his clothes and listened intently for any signs of danger before sprinting towards the creek where his ships awaited. He crept through the woods, silent as a ghost, until he reached the creek. Without encountering any obstacles, he beheld his precious ships lying out in the distance. Their location was further than when he departed, but to Hardanger it seemed to be a positive sign. Not willing to take any chances, he bundled his cloak on his back, grasped his sword with his teeth, and took to the water. He swam with extreme caution to avoid any detection, ready to make a quick escape if it was not his comrades on board. As he approached the ships within shooting distance, his trusted headman bellowed, "Who goes there?" In response, Hardanger let out a low whistle recognized by all. The crew erupted with jubilation at the sight of their long-lost leader. Swiftly a rope was thrown to him, and he was hoisted aboard, standing amongst his men, dripping wet with an unusual sword in his mouth. "Hardanger! Hardanger!" they yelled, clamoring to touch him. Anxious to get an update on the battle's outcome, Hardanger inquired about his men's fate. To his relief, only 3 men had perished, and 2 were wounded. The remainder of his men were rescued and accounted for, which delighted him. They interrogated him with a barrage of questions, eagerly waiting to hear his story. Hardanger was pleased that they were genuinely concerned about his welfare. Before he opened up about his ordeal, he questioned them about their next step. To his surprise, they had planned on remaining there for a few more days if the weather permitted it. After all, they hoped that there would be some news of his condition. All the Viking warriors standing on the dragon ships were mesmerized by Hardanger's magnificently crafted sword. He changed into dry clothes, but remained nestled snugly in his bearskin bag. With everyone intently focused on him, he revealed his tail, lying on his back with the moonbeams flickering on his features. He began with his tumble down the steep ravine, and as the fire crackled and the shadows danced, he regaled his crew with a tale of survival that would make even the bravest whimper. He recounted how, in a moment of desperate ingenuity, he lodged his trusty axe into the earth and held on tight, before plummeting into the dark abyss, and then, with a sense of rueful resignation, how he was forced to let go and drop like a stone when his assailants began to prick him. But of course, the saga did not end there. With the resourcefulness of a man pushed to the brink, he shared how he had awoken weaponless and alone, with only his wits to keep him safe, and how he had fled through the tangled forest, stalked by the ever-present threat of danger. As he spoke, his men leaned in, rapt with attention and anticipation. They listened with bated breath as he recounted his desperate struggle for survival, all but the brief episode with the flat stone that he felt paled in comparison to the other trials he had endured. But then something strange happened. As he prepared to recount the final chapter of his harrowing ordeal, he faltered for the first time. He found himself reluctant to share the truth of how he had acquired the sword, knowing the ghoulish curiosity of his audience. "The sword!" came the gruff murmur of the old headman, his voice grating in the night air. "What of it?" Hardanger took a deep breath and stared into the void of the starry sky, and with a deep sense of unease, he let the words spill out, each more fantastical than the last. "It was the most incredible thing," he said with a wry smile. "I had finally clawed my way out of the ravine and found myself lost in the forest. I was running blindly, with no sense of direction, when I stumbled upon the opening of a vast cave. It seemed like a perfect hiding place, and so I crept inside, seeking refuge from the dangers lurking in the woods." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "But as I crept deeper into the cave, I heard the strangest sound, a haunting melody that echoed off the walls and made my blood run cold. I cautiously made my way towards the source of the sound, and there, in the darkness, I saw him." "Him?" his men echoed in disbelief. "A man, or what had once been a man," Hardanger replied, his voice hushed. His skin was sallow and jaundiced, his eyes wild with madness, and he was singing. Oh, how he was singing! It was a song that spoke of death and decay and all the horrors that lurk in the shadows. And as I watched, I saw that he was not alone. For there, on the wall of the cave, hung a sword, glinting in the flickering light. The tension in the air was palpable now, as his men leaned in even closer. "Without a weapon of my own, I knew that I needed that sword. My life depended on it," Hardanger continued, his voice shaking. "So I crept forward, inching my way closer and closer until I was almost upon it. And then, in an instant, it all went wrong. I stumbled over a jutting rock in the cave floor, and the next thing I knew, he was on me. that man, that thing that was no longer alive. He let the words hang in the air, reveling in the sense of fear and excitement that emanated from his men. But I fought back. Oh, how I fought back! And in the end I emerged victorious, that sword clutched tightly in my hand. And so, my friends, that is how I came to possess the finest weapon in all the land." The fire crackled and the shadows danced as his men sat, breathless and awed by the story. And somewhere in the darkness a branch creaked and a twig snapped, a reminder that danger was never far away. Hardanger's tale had his men gripped, their eyes wide and bodies pressed together in deathly silence. As he recounted the imaginary battle, a cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and he paused to take a deep breath. "So near to the dead I have never been," he continued, his voice low and hushed. "You have no idea what power there is in a dead man's bones. He crushed me as though with claws of iron. The most uncomfortable part was that wherever I seized hold of him, the flesh slipped away under my grip, and I held the bare bone pipes with my hands. And there was a most intolerable smell which nearly suffocated me. Moreover, the whole time he kept wheezing foam into my face." Hardanger groaned and wiped the sweat from his brow, his burning eyes fixed on his men. He lay there in the pale moonlight, white as a corpse. "At last I succeeded in getting him under me," he said, his voice still lowered, "and putting out my utmost strength, I pushed him against the stone he had sat upon, and at last I broke his back. While he lay there, and before I had seized the sword to cut off his wretched head, his rotten tongue continued to spit out curses. I will not repeat them, for they were terrible. Only so much I will tell you, that he said there was a spell on this sword, that whosoever should kill with it should die with it." Hardanger's old headman, who had been listening with increasing agitation, suddenly sprang up in great excitement. "Throw the cursed sword overboard!" he shouted, his whole body trembling with fear. Hardanger reached for the sword, and clutching its golden hilt firmly, he answered decidedly, "No, I have risked too much to gain it." The old man broke down with a hiccoughing sob, sending an ice-cold shudder through the rest of the group. "What did you do then with the dead man?" one finally asked, his teeth chattering with fear. "I chopped his head off and put it by his feet," Hardanger answered bluntly, exhaling with relief. With nothing more to say, Hardanger lay there in silence. His men remained still and unresponsive around him. Suddenly, Hardanger felt a strange detachment from his encounter with the monk. Was it real, or just a dream? Had he truly fought a dead man? His body felt numb and rigid, and a strange smell lingered in his nostrils, confusing his thoughts and blurring the line between reality and fantasy. The old man had also grown quiet, taking a moment to reflect with his head buried in his cloak. But then he spoke again, with his deep, gentle voice. "In honor of your amazing bravery, you shall now be known as Hjor Hardanger," he declared solemnly to Hardanger. Hardanger smiled, his eyes half closed in exhaustion before drifting off into peaceful slumber. His comrades watched him sleep, still afraid to close their own eyes and succumb to the unearthly light of the moon. But when Hardanger awoke at sunrise, he was invigorated and full of energy, awakening with a roar of laughter. "Beer for everyone!" he exclaimed, lifting the spirits of his men. Even the most tired men found themselves swept up in his excitement, laughing and playing until the air was filled with merriment. They marveled at his fearlessness and bravery, and knew that Hjor Hardanger was a name truly fitting for such a great warrior. After downing a couple of jugs of beer, Hardanger's stomach growled with a ferocity that only a robust meal could quell. The last 24 hours had been a blur of empty bellies and a handful of uncooked shellfish that might have not existed at all. His hunger gnawed at him like a savage beast, leaving him with a ravenous appetite. His crew looked at him with awe and disbelief as they watched him devour his meal. The icy dread from the moonlit night before still lingered within them, gripping them with bodily nausea. Even the beer he'd given them was consumed out of obligation rather than pleasure. Once he had roused his men from their stupor, he had them man the oars. Hardanger demanded they row with the strength of boys, invoking their families as inspiration. He warned them to row as if their lives depended on it. For now, Hardanger had had enough adventure. He only longed to return to Norway. The seafaring life had lost its luster, and home was calling. Chapter 5. Astrid was filled with both faithful longing and anxious anticipation as she awaited Hardanger's return from his expedition. The autumn day was raw and cold and shrouded in fog, but her heart swelled with joy at the sight of his ship sailing in the fjord. The red flag waving from the mast confirmed their agreed-upon signal, and she knew that her happiness was on board. Just the fact of his survival was a gift from the heavens in her eyes. Every time Hardanger returned home, it felt new and miraculous to her that he was alive and standing before her. He brought with him a sense of renewal and springtime, having left any dangerous unrest behind on his adventures. Now he was himself again, with a contented assurance in his voice, and a cheerful laugh that melted any worries away. For Astrid, the pain of waiting and the anxiety of the summer were all worth it for the joy of having him back in her arms. His eager questions and stories made her heart swell with happiness, and she often found herself forgetting to answer or listen, instead throwing herself into his embrace to weep and laugh with joy. But it wasn't just his happiness that Hardanger brought back with him. He was never empty-handed after an expedition, and this time he had gained not only serfs and goods, but a new name, Hjor Hardanger. When Harold, Halveig, and Astrid first heard the name, they couldn't help but laugh. But Hardanger explained eagerly, and with a little embarrassment, that it was a name one of his men had given him. He was proud of the addition to his name, and the valuable sword that had earned him the honor. With utmost gravity, Hardanger disclosed that a bizarre tale was associated with his sword. Once, he recounted to his men, but it was not something to be bandied about. He had no intention of revisiting it. Nevertheless, his old headman relished sharing it, ensuring that Hardanger's exploit wouldn't be lost to history. And he told it so chillingly that one couldn't sleep soundly for days after hearing the quavering timbre of the old man's voice narrating the spine-tingling horrors Hardanger had braved in the cavern. There was no doubt that he deserved the moniker Hjor Hardanger, an appellation he favoured, particularly since everyone had learned about how he secured his weapon. Henceforth, no one referred to him by any other name. Harold and the others did not doubt that the tale was factual, the sword serving as ample evidence. Furthermore, it was very Hardanger to not just fight against the living, but also prove his mettle against the deceased, emerging unscathed. Hjor Hardanger had no inclination to recount the story himself. It was not a happy memory. All his other escapades, big and small, he was generally amenable to sharing, and he rarely took them seriously. His account of how he dangled over the cliff, clutching his axe handle while being jabbed by spear points, could make even a corpse convulse with laughter, even though it wasn't a pleasant predicament. That was the Hardanger Harold adored, the one he couldn't resist, who shared his experiences in such a light-hearted and carefree way. For a long time, Harold couldn't hold back his mirth after Hjor Hardanger divulged his story about the small indentation and the flat stone. To Astrid alone, Hjor Hardanger revealed a magnificent story that he couldn't determine if it was an actual occurrence or a dream. On an island he once swam to, Hjor Hardanger met a hermit who had decoded a remarkable tale from some cryptic marks on scraps of skin. The tale described a place called Paradise, and a mystical bird known as the Phoenix. Astrid, Hjor Hardanger's companion, hadn't heard of either the bird or the place. She suspected the story was merely a dream, despite her belief that her partner's life was full of limitless possibilities. Hjor Hardanger also had reservations, but remembered the hermit's action of serving him shellfish, which he had eaten despite his aversion to it. He assumed it must have been another component of the dream. However, Hjor Hardanger couldn't erase the monk's story from his memory. A piece of the dream had been left unmentioned, which caused him restlessness. In his dream, he had stolen the hermit's sword, making it a bad dream to remember. When Hjor Hardanger returned home from his summer Viking expedition, Harold had already sold their goods, cattle, and even his dragon ship, indicating his intention to lead a more pacifist life. Hjor Hardanger repeated his dream's account, expressing that he too would hang up his expedition boots. They consequently agreed to exchange ships and purchase a robust trading ship the next spring. Eventually they bought the ships and everything was set for their next venture. The arrival of winter sparked a vibrant and unsteady season for the Somagnus brothers. Relatives and friends flooded in from far and wide to enjoy their hospitality. The festivities made Hjor Hardanger euphoric, with his joyous mood spreading to Astrid. She lost herself in the joy of having Hardanger, forgetting all her troubles, even her deepest secrets. Day and night blended in a state of pure happiness, leaving no room for anything else. As she drifted off to sleep, Astrid would think, "You won't wake up in the Magnusing," and a smile crept across her face. Her happiness was so profound that life and death became intertwined. The celebration never stopped. When their house wasn't hosting a feast, they were guests at a week-long celebration in another house. Among their friends and relatives, many were eager to follow Harold and Hjor Hardanger to the new land if they prospered. Norway was no longer the same country it used to be, and people no longer knew if they were free or if they belonged to King Hellstorm. Recently one of Hellstorm's Knuds killed Atle Knud the Slender, and Hafnar Fjordur kept his rights and inheritance only because of Hellstorm's permission. Many others were in the same position. Anyone who muttered a word of dissent lost their life and their land. Finding a free place beyond the reach of Hellstorm's grasp would be an excellent idea. Hjor Hardanger reminded Harold that he had been predicting this for a while. He was not afraid of solitude in the new land. Before too long, the best people from Norway would possess the whole of the vast land. Hjor Hardanger spoke about the matter contentedly and without reservations. He was unaware of any responsibility, as usual. Harold, however, was burdened with a sense of responsibility and anxiety about the prospect of drawing others away from their inheritance and their country. Above everything else, he wondered whether it was the gods' wish that he should go there. Harold organized a grand Yuletide sacrificial feast, seeking the will of the gods. On the first night of the feast, the lot casting began. The chips or sticks dipped in sacrificial blood were hurled onto a piece of cloth. Their positions formed characters that would guide Harold's journey. The chips revealed an I for ice, which meant travel, and an F for cattle and wealth. All the other characters were favorable, save for one that signaled death. But Harold knew that death was inevitable, even if he stayed home. So he wasn't worried, and the journey preparations continued. Winter passed, and the days grew longer. Spring came with festive warmth, and the brothers readied their vessel. Harold brought the high-seat pillars and the images of gods on board. Hardanger, in laughter, watched Harold and his comrades dragging the pillars from the temple to the ship. He wondered if Harold had become any wiser. Astrid, holding Hjor Hardanger's hand, awoke from her happiness days as they sailed out between islands covered by evergreens. Pine scent gently wafted towards her with the breeze. Hjor Hardanger felt her hand grow cold and squeezed it more tightly. Suddenly her hand began to tremble, and Hjor Hardanger searched her eyes for any trouble. But she smiled her pleasant smile at him, and he kissed her. He drew her near, wrapped a skin around her, and sheltered her from the cold. They sailed beyond the islands into the vast blue sea, and the heavily loaded ships moved with the wind's steady blow. Chapter 6. The Magnus brothers' ships thrashed about violently, tossed to and fro in the tumultuous waves to the south of Iceland. Despite the tempestuous chaos, the day was still and warm. Wispy clouds scattered across the vast blue expanse above, while the sun radiated its strong springtime light, casting everything in bright relief. For 2 weeks they had been voyaging from Drammen, tossed and battered by the fierce winds. A savage storm had ripped their sails and shattered their yards, flinging them across a raging sea that relentlessly bombarded the low gunwales with icy spray. From morning until night, 4 men at a time bailed water from each vessel with scoops, struggling against exhaustion in their tireless battle to keep the vessels afloat. Despite rotating shifts, the men were so worn out that they could barely manage to eat, frequently collapsing wherever they found a brief moment of respite. With determined vigilance and skilled seamanship, the brothers managed to keep their ships together. Each took turns at the helm, never sleeping for long except during short lulls or changes in the wind. Amid all the chaos, Astrid and Halveig remained focused on survival. Astrid kept out of the way and helped where she could, unnoticed, while Halveig huddled with her son, fixated on Harold for comfort and security. The Magnus brothers fought for their lives against the treacherous storm and the merciless sea. Their primary goal was to endure, to avoid giving up, to remain fixated solely on steering and managing the sails, and to prevent exhaustion and panic. The perpetual and severe struggle served to keep their spirits alive, despite the relentlessly hostile environment. The animals aboard the ship were suffering greatly. Many had become sick and starving, and the crew had already been forced to throw some overboard. Others lay in agony, their pitiful condition a difficult sight to behold. Even the ship's supplies of food and drink had been spoiled by the unrelenting spray from the sea, causing the fresh water to gradually disappear from the barrels. The men were moving about with a weary sluggishness that had to be combated with a strict hand, and everything on board was less than it should have been, causing great concern. Despite all of this, the brothers persevered. Finally, after days upon days of turmoil, they spotted a faint white light on the northern horizon. It was a sign they had been searching for, and the brothers had been on the edge for too long, barely holding on. The storm eventually quieted down, and they now lay becalmed just a few hours away from the coast of the strange new land. As they gazed out at the sea, the ships were positioned next to each other, kept in place by long poles to avoid any damage caused by a shake of the waters. Hjor Hardanger and Astrid boarded Harold's ship to greet him and Halvai and to discuss their options. They all sat quietly on the back of the boat after the intense trial they had been through, still shaken and not quite used to the idea that life could move at a more relaxed pace. They kept their voices low, as if they were in a revered sanctuary rather than on a turbulent ship. The backdrop of blue mountains was punctuated by the softened lines of glaciers, and the brothers couldn't help but stare as they navigated their way toward the new land they hoped would change their lives forever. Harold and Hjor Hardanger sat in silence, their eyes scanning the land before them. The coast extended on for miles, marked by a flurry of white surf crashing against its shore. Hardanger broke the silence with a frustrated tone. "It will be difficult to land here. Most of the land appears to be barren sand." Harold replied calmly, "There are plenty of landing places near the projecting points. Beyond the sands, the land may be fertile, even up to the glaciers. We saw this on the eastern side last summer." Harold couldn't help but feel disappointed they hadn't found the Svanafjords again, but he kept this to himself. For now, it was more important to get on land quickly, and let the men and animals rest and recover. The Sir Magnus brothers agreed they would settle for the summer and winter on the spot they landed before finding a permanent residence. Harold had strong opinions about where they should reside, but he hadn't confided these thoughts to Hjor Hardanger or anyone else. It was a matter concerning the gods, and his brother had already made up his mind about anything related to them. Hjor Hardanger, on the other hand, only cared about finding a pleasant and fertile spot near the sea, protected by the mountains. The two sat in silence for a while, lost in their own thoughts. Harold was deep in thought about how best to communicate his plan to Hjor Hardanger. He knew that there was no more time to waste, and that they had to act before they departed from this place. Despite his efforts, he couldn't find the right words. As Harold struggled with his thoughts, Hjor Hardanger was deep in reflection over an experience he had the previous night. He had slept while his headman took charge of the tiller, and this gave him much to ponder. He started awake, his mind still caught in the trappings of a dream he could not grasp. As he sat up, he collided with one of his Irish serfs, Duftak, whose unwavering gaze had always unnerved him. A man he had once thrown to the ground. Their paths had not crossed since until now. It seemed that Duftak had something in his grasp that he had hastily thrown overboard, causing a small splash. Hjor Hardanger couldn't be certain, but the look in the serf's eyes betrayed an undercurrent of covetousness. It wasn't the first time he had caught Duftak creeping around Astrid, watching her every move. Hjor Hardanger wondered why he hadn't thrown the serf overboard yet. Was it fear, or something more? He knew that the safety of his Irish serfs lay in their numbers. If he killed one, he'd have to wipe them all out. He tried to shake off these thoughts, asking his brother if they would sail south once the wind picked up. Harold was silent, considering both points, but had the desire to land near the more easterly of the two. Instead of a direct response, he spoke of letting the gods choose his path in this new land. Hardanger, still feeling the lingering irritation from the earlier incident, laughed harshly. How could Harold leave such a decision up to the gods? It was then that he noticed the pillars of his high seat, lashed together on the ship's deck, as if in answer to his question. "I'll toss my high seat pillars overboard. Wherever they land, that's where I'll settle," proclaimed Harold confidently. Hjor Hardanger was skeptical. "Even if they wash up on the sandy shores here?" he asked, incredulously and a bit scornfully. Harold remained undisturbed. "The gods will guide us to the perfect place for me and my family to dwell. I trust them to make the decision." For a long time, Hjor Hardanger stayed silent, a hard line forming around his mouth. Harold and his cursed gods. At last, Hjor Hardanger spoke, not looking at anything in particular. "So instead of choosing a fertile and beautiful land for ourselves, we'll settle wherever the wind and current take us. We'll be at the mercy of fate and chance." He talked himself into a bitterness, ending with a sharp jab. "Looks like we won't be neighbors, brother." Harold was about to respond angrily when a memory flooded his mind. It was a snowy day when he and Hjor Hardanger rode alone over a desolate heath. Harold closed his lips tightly, his seeking gaze wandering over the water as he tried to think of kind and cautious words to say. But his decision stood unwaveringly. Suddenly, he collected himself and called for 2 of his men to take down the high seat pillars and lay them on the gunwale. Harold carefully touched the age-browned wood, feeling a sense of determination. Hjor Hardanger watched with cold, calculating eyes. Then Harold gently let the pillars glide overboard, watching as they floated on the shiny water. Hjor Hardanger could only see his back, but the look of resolve irritated him even more. Halveig and Astrid listened anxiously, not daring to make eye contact. Astrid couldn't decide who was right or wrong, but a strange fear weighed heavily on her gentle heart, making it beat heavily and painfully. Halveig, however, had conflicting thoughts about Hjor Hardanger. At first, she believed that a person's own choosing of a home could be better than that of blind gods, and even safer. But as she sat and watched her husband Harold's back, her perspective shifted. His secure and confident demeanor had an unconscious effect on her, causing her to understand that the god's approval was needed to firmly attach her husband's heart to his new home. Harold would feel at home with his whole soul where the pillars of his high seat drifted on shore, and the god's choice would provide him with the ground he needed to thrive. On this chosen spot, Harold would force happiness and prosperity to flourish despite obstacles. With the gods as his allies, he was invincible. Halveig became peaceful and content in her heart as she realized that Harold's actions were based on an unwaveringly sure and wise instinct. It was crucial for him to feel that he was in covenant with the gods and had their favor. She leaned down to kiss her little boy on the forehead and remained seated for a while to conceal the tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, Harold stood with bated breath as he watched his beloved pillars being tossed by the billows like ordinary driftwood. He had agonized over the decision to part with his dearest possession. But life was at stake, and finding a place for his family to thrive was not just about grazing cattle and a sturdy house. It was about discovering precisely the location that the gods willed to grant him. The place where they could ensure their future, where their happiness and prosperity were in their own hands. Harold gazed at the pillars drifting away, his anger towards his brother fading away. With a calm smile, he sat beside Hjor Hardanger. "What do you think of landing at the eastern point, brother?" Harold asked amiably. Hardanger felt irritation rise within him. There was no choice. They would land wherever the driftwood took them. "I have chosen the west," he replied firmly, feeling a sense of satisfaction at his response. But his words had an unexpected impact on Halveig and Astrid. They sensed danger brewing. Astrid instinctively called out to Hjor Hardanger, a plea in her voice. She didn't want to influence him, but she couldn't help it. She knew him and knew it was hopeless. Hjor Hardanger's anger boiled over at Astrid's words. "You can stay with your brother. You obviously prefer it over following me." His words were bitter, cutting like a knife. Astrid couldn't stop the wave of despair that overtook her, tears streaming down her face. Hardanger sat stone-faced, but his heart was in turmoil. The pain within him was unbearable, the scene with the surf, Duftak, haunting him still. He knew Astrid would be safer on Harold's ship. It was not a sudden whim, as it had seemed, but a decision born of a sleepless night. A vague and groundless feeling of danger made Hjor Hardanger even more sensitive and impatient. He couldn't shake the sense that something terrible awaited them on their journey with Astrid. It was pure tenderness for Astrid that made him decide they should part ways before reaching the shore. This time he hadn't thought of leaving Harold behind, but his restless temperament overtook him, and he quickly made the impulsive decision to separate from the others and seek another landing place. The thought of not seeing his companions for a whole year was an unbearable trial for Hjor Hardanger. He couldn't fathom how he could endure even a month without them. For Harold, however, a year's separation was nothing unthinkable or alarming. His equable temperament allowed him to approach the decision with reason. If they landed in separate places, they would have to remain where they were. But for Hjor Hardanger, it was impossible to expose his dependence and pain at parting. His spirit was too proud to submit to a reasonable discussion. As soon as he spoke the fateful words, he was powerless to take them back. While Hjor Hardanger's thoughts and emotions rushed through him, Harold had already contemplated their options. One advantage of separation was that whoever found the landing place first could signal the other by lighting a fire. Harold could see the coast was difficult, if not impossible, to land on. The open sea and heavy swells made it dangerous for ships to approach. It was uncertain if the coast near the 2 points was equally difficult, or if the coast east or south of the points was better. Nevertheless, since Hjor Hardanger insisted on leaving, Harold had no objections to their separation, whether it be for a few days or a year. So it was decided that whoever landed first would light a fire on their point as a signal to the other. If no other harbour was found, they could make their way there, or if they had found another, they could answer with their own fire. Hjor Hardanger agreed to the terms, although it was disappointing to him that they had to separate. Harold was calm and collected, stating that he may come back southward in the spring or send a messenger if he had not heard from Hjor Hardanger before then. Hjor Hardanger was frustrated that Harold acted as if nothing had happened between them. Harold continued, imploring Hjor Hardanger to take good care of his pillars if he found them and inform him as soon as possible. Hjor Hardanger said nothing but internally swore that he would burn them if he found them. The four of them sat in silence, swinging on the sea, each with their own thoughts and feelings. As the gold-red sun in the west faded, the world became new and strange, charged with presentiment as day turned into night. Harold's son, Asgardston, slept quietly in his mother's arms, while the four of them let the day slip away into the peaceful stillness of the night.